Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you might be as you watch this recording. So it's a short recording, and really its purpose is to maybe answer a few questions that have been maybe sent our way in recent weeks about effectual innovation. So we've been involved in a number of events recently about effectual innovation, and as a result, maybe we're gathering a set of questions that people are asking around the effectual innovation. If you're new to effectual innovation, then I think this session and the answers to these questions could be useful to you in sort of outlining what it is and its key elements. If you want to know more about it other than what you see in this video, there's other videos again that we've been creating from events we've been part of. So one of the questions I suppose that comes up every so often is that and especially because we're talking a lot about, maybe some of the nuances of effectual innovation, but people sometimes ask, well, what are the core elements of effectual innovation that really mark it out? And sometimes when I'm answering that question, I will draw on an old European folk story called Stone Soup. Now, there's variations of this story in lots of different countries, and all of them slightly different. But I suppose my take on it, and it's a take that's used and has been used by others also to inspire what we call open source movements, maybe more democratized versions of innovation. Is this story. So just to maybe draw on the very quickly on the elements of it, it really entails two visitors coming to an old village, and as they walk through the streets, they noticed that there was very little engagement on those streets. There were activities happening in individual homes, but very little coming together of people. So they walked through the village, and again, there was very little to be seen. But when they reached the little square, what they did is they had picked up two large stones, which they later referred to as their magic stones. And the only possession they really had was a pot that they used to make their meals as they used to travel through the land. They put the two stones into the pot, filled it with water from a nearby stream, built a fire underneath, and started stirring this concoction, which at this stage was really only water and stones. But what happened next was interesting. They could see people starting to look out the doors and windows of the houses in the village, and slowly one villager came to them and a bit nervously said, what are you doing? And they said, oh, we're cooking delicious stone soup. Would you not come and join us? It's absolutely delicious. And the villager said, oh, sure. And after a while, the two visitors said, it would even be nicer if we had some maybe seasoning. And next thing, the villager said, oh, I can bring some carrots. So the villager went away, brought back a small pile of carrots, and they added it to the mix and stirred up. But slowly but surely, other villagers had also joined them in the square. And again, each of them were asked, would you not join us for a delicious meal? And in turn, each of them said, oh, I can bring onions, or I can bring I don't know, asparagus, or I can bring whatever else. And after maybe a period of time, what was stone soup was now truly delicious, and it was shared out among all the villagers. And it was one of the first times that all these villagers had an opportunity of coming together and collaborating on something other than what they would have done individually in their own homes. And at the end of this get together, the two visitors donated these magic stones to the village and said, anytime in the future, you're hungry or you want to come together, these magic stones can be used to replicate what had happened on that day in the village. And I think this story, even though it's a very traditional ancient story, it really characterizes many of the principles of effectual innovation, as well as I said, open source movements, etc. And just call out some of those principles now, and hopefully you can see, how they reflect the story we've just told. Was one starting point for effectual innovation is we start with a certain type of question, and the question is essentially along the lines of what's the best possible future we can create with what we already have without any individual having to take on undue risk. Okay, so this question is key. So what's the best possible future we can create with what we already have without taking on undue risk? Now, I think once you're in that mindset, there's then these other principles start to come into play, but they're all driven by this question. So one of the principles really is the fact that we're a pilot in our own futures. We pilot our own plane. Individually and together, we can design our own future. And that future together can be a lot better than what it would be if we can't collaborate or we don't collaborate. Okay, so this is the first principle, this idea of piloting the plane. The second principle really is that we can share an ambition, as I said, that's bigger than the ambition we can achieve individually. And this idea of shared ambition. Another one is the bird in hand principle. Let's start with what we already have, because we know if we over plan it, very often there's a realization the assets we have, the resources we have aren't sufficient to achieve this big plan, and inertia sets in. So instead we start with what we have. Okay, so that's the third principle. A fourth one is this idea of the affordable loss. Let's start by each of us giving something of ourselves, something smaller that we're comfortable committing. Okay, and then let's iterate our way forward. And generally what we find is as we build small successes, we start to build more momentum and we start to build more trust where we're willing to give more of ourselves. Okay, and I suppose that's really important, because what it does is builds this virtuous cycle where we're achieving a lot more as we proceed than we were maybe when we first started. Okay, and I think those principles are very important. Now, when you see those principles at play in initiatives, you start to see certain patterns of behavior then starting to emerge. And these patterns, I would say, are very characteristic of effectual innovation. So look, there's many of those patterns. I think there's at least sort of 10, 20 really characteristic patterns we could call out. So maybe just to refer to a small number of these, while in the time we've available. I suppose first is this idea of low friction collaboration. We start to see I suppose the perception of collaboration as being low friction, that it's maybe it starts as something small and that we're committing small sets of resources to it, and that in time then our perception of what's tolerable starts to build up, and we start to see the collaboration starting to take off from there. But essentially we start with what we call low friction collaboration. Now, also, we very much see a pattern of piggybacking, so very often effectual innovation starts within an existing project, maybe within an existing organization. So the idea of piggybacking might be, say, this project is mandated to deliver maybe X. But what we do is we ask ourselves, yes, we'll deliver X, but what more than X can we deliver as part of this project? And we start to piggyback off an existing project to maybe create a lot more than the ambition of that initial project. Okay, and it's that idea of piggybacking. We also, I suppose, the pattern of bootstrapping is very strong. You know that again, like I said earlier, we're piggybacking maybe on projects, but we're also bootstrapping what we already have. I have this, you have that, someone else has something else. When we put them together, then we can move beyond the initial ambition of this initiative to achieve a lot more. Um, Now, I think really important also are these patterns around smallness. We refer to small a lot. So now, I suppose there's reasons for that. We know that small teams are probably more effective than larger teams. So we tend to start with small teams. Starting with I suppose small targets where we've small starts, small steps, where we're constantly learning. So that pattern of smallness is very, very important within effectual innovation. Really important is as well is because we start with limited resources, we really try and avoid the battles. Okay, so instead of getting caught up in battles, maybe because of bureaucracy, etc., and bureaucracy putting a large tax, sorry, on everything we do, is we try and avoid those battles, the battles of bureaucracy in particular, by doing stuff maybe that is done in a different way, out of the way sometimes, sometimes out of sight until the momentum starts to build up. So we tend to try and we try and avoid the battles, try and build momentum. And then as that momentum builds, then hopefully we see another pattern, which is the pattern of contagion. So again, within effectual innovation, very often we see an emphasis on contagion, where we start things locally, but then as we're starting to develop maybe new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, and effectual innovation is one way of doing things in new ways, is then as people move out of those initial teams back into other teams, they bring some of those elements with them, or even as they're promoted through an organization, they bring those elements with them. Now, in a way, small is beautiful, because small tends to be the way we make big changes. Big culture changes tend to happen very locally initially, where that contagion starts to click in, where it starts to become more and more mainstream. And as it builds strength, it starts to replace some of the existing elements of the status quo. And I know in previous events, we've referred to examples of where that has happened, whether it's maybe, in NASA, whether it's in Microsoft, whether it's in projects and organizations that we ourselves have been involved in. And I think those conversations and examples are all cases in point of that. So look, I look forward to maybe engaging further on these elements, and hopefully it gives you a sense of really what's at the essence of effectual innovation, and also maybe to point out is that really effectual innovation is about a democratization of change, where we probably push the decision-making authority down into teams, but when we're doing that, we make people in those teams more accountable for for taking on those responsibilities, but we also empower them to be able to use this power in a more effective way. And generally, we bring in very human-centered design approaches into that equation, so that people can work more effectively together to create more effective human-centered change. So I look forward to catching up with you and answering more questions in due course. Take care and have a good day.